Good morning. It's great to be here, and what a lovely sight to see so many people, and just in a place of the world of Britain that I don't regularly come to, I must admit. So it's lovely to be here in Bristol. I know I've already met a few people who have come from surrounding areas. So I bring my greetings from my part of the world, which is Woking in Surrey. And I'm really pleased to be able to be here for the whole day to share with you all some of what I've been seeing and feeling and documenting over the last couple of years, really. And it was lovely to hear what Nigel had to say about his experience on the island of Lewis, and yes, this story of the revivals that took place there some 100 years ago now. But the question, I suppose, is, can that happen again? I grew up in a church that often talked about revival, but actually, I suppose I was quite skeptical. I wasn't seeing that happen around me. I often sort of felt like there was more talk than action. And I wouldn't even describe what I'm going to be presenting about this morning as a revival, but it might just be the beginning conditions for what we might eventually call a revival. Who knows? I'm not a good prophet of things. I was predicting Kamala to win, so we're all going to be proved wrong at some point. We're all going to be surprised, but I do believe, as Nigel said, or somebody I spoke to just this morning said, God is God, and actually there's something about Christian faith that means that whatever it looks like, we have a God who acts in surprising ways, a God who often, when things look dead and buried, brings resurrection. And so I'm excited to share with you a little bit of what I've been seeing and talking about and writing about over the last year or so. And I think just to give you a sense of an expectation of how the day will go, I think this first session I'll be presenting kind of my thesis, really, on the so-called surprising rebirth of belief in God. And we'll have an extended time for Q&A, I think up to lunch. And then after lunch, we'll lean more into what this means for the church. And if you're here as a church leader or someone involved in leadership, what might the practical application of this be in our context, and so on. So thank you so much again for coming and being willing to listen to me for probably far longer than you'll want to in the end. But I want to begin, if you could bring my slides up, with a quote from quite a well-known poem, Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, written about 150 years ago. I think the quote's going to be on the next slide. Here we are. Dover Beach, written by Matthew Arnold, a Victorian poet, and it has this well-worn phrase in the poem. It says, "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." And that melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith has stood in for generations now as a symbol of faith going out on the tide in Western culture. When you think that Matthew Arnold actually wrote these words 150 years ago, which was actually sort of the height of the Victorian church-going era, it's interesting that even he recognized that in his own generation, he was starting to see faith go out as science, secularism, technology, in some sense started to replace a natural belief that people had in God and in God's activity in the world. And you could say that going out of the tide has only accelerated in the last 150 years, as we live now in a very post-Christian culture, a culture where obviously church-going has been in decline for many years, not just here in the UK, but also in strongholds even in the USA, where actually increasingly, especially younger generations, are describing themselves as non-religious, the rise of the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who don't claim any religious affiliation. And so a lot of people have said, well, Matthew Arnold called it 150 years ago. This is where the story is going, and this is what we can expect to see, the eventual decline and eventual terminal death of Christianity in the West. Now, of course, this isn't the story elsewhere in the world, where we're seeing arguably unprecedented growth in various parts of the world of the Christian church. But if you like, our interest for today will remain primarily in the West, in the UK, America, Australia, Canada, other parts of the Western world, where there is a similar picture at play. But I had an interesting conversation a few years ago with someone some of you may be familiar with, Douglas Murray. We've got a picture of him as well. We were actually contemporaries at Oxford University, but he's gone on to much bigger and more influential things than me as associate editor of The Spectator. He's a somewhat conservative cultural critic, and he's an interesting person because when I had him in conversation, he described himself as a Christian atheist. It's an interesting title to wear. It's obviously a deliberately sort of oxymoronic. It's a contradiction in terms, a Christian atheist. But Douglas Murray's story is that he sort of grew up with a sort of public school faith, but it kind of had fizzled out by his early 20s. And he very much became a friend of a group of people I'll introduce to you, but I'm sure some of you are familiar with in a moment, the New Atheists. But I'd invited him on to a conversation. This would have been in, I think it was 2021. And he was in conversation with N.T. Wright, the biblical scholar. And they were discussing the question of what our culture will look like and how we conceive of meaning and miracle and mythology in a very post-Christian culture. And Douglas Murray himself referenced this famous poem by Matthew Arnold about the melancholy long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And he said to me, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is that it could come back in again. After all, that is the point of tides. And he was saying this, as I say, in the context himself of being what he describes as a sort of unsatisfied agnostic. As a so-called Christian atheist, he's perfectly clear that he doesn't believe in the claims of Christianity. But at the same time, he can't deny the fact that a lot of his beliefs about life, about morality, are shaped by the Christian story. And he was noting, in saying this idea that perhaps there might be a turning of the tide when it comes to the sea of faith, he was noticing a lot of his contemporaries, secular people, starting to talk in very different terms about Christianity. And he was even noticing a number of surprising instances of his friends and secular peers becoming Christians. And he said, perhaps we're at a moment, Justin, where actually the church does have an opportunity to speak into a more receptive crowd. And that really resonated with me because I've been noticing something similar to Douglas Murray. Whether or not you agree with him on his political views, I sensed that he had pinpointed something that I'd been seeing in the culture as well. And that was a significant change in the tone of the conversation. So I began hosting faith discussion conversations around the mid-2000s. I think we've got a slide of these four gentlemen here. I began hosting these conversations at a time when the so-called New Atheism was very much in the ascendancy. The four people on the screen are the so-called four horsemen of New Atheism. From left to right, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Each of them were scientists or public intellectuals, and each of them had written, in around the mid-2000s, a best-selling anti-God book, probably the best-known one, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, sold millions of copies around the world. And they were really sort of spearheading a movement at that point that was gaining traction through the internet, through sort of people getting together at atheist conferences, especially in North America and other parts of the world, and kind of coming hot on the heels of 9/11 in a sense that actually religion was bad for us. Not only was it false, but it was also evil. And so this movement really sort of was coming into its own at the time that I started hosting faith debates on a show called Unbelievable. I remember particularly hosting a conversation, I think it would have been 2008, 2009, on the so-called atheist bus campaign. Don't know if any of you remember that. But that was very much sort of the closest thing to an advertising campaign that atheism had ever had. These buses circulating London, bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And this was the kind of atmosphere, if you like, where the public conversation on faith was happening. The new atheists were very confident, very brash. They were very dismissive of faith. In fact, ridicule was one of the main ways in which they engaged with people of faith and religious ideas. And so this was the kind of conversations that I was hosting on the show. I think there's another picture of me in situ, as it were. The Unbelievable show very much began on Premier Christian Radio back in 2005. I was only 25 years old. It's hard to remember back that far. But it was a really interesting, invigorating, lively time to be hosting these kinds of conversations, because there were big characters on both sides. These, quite demonstrative atheists on the one hand, who were, had plenty of column inches, TV shows, best-selling books and so on. And on the other hand, I was bringing in Christian thinkers to kind of engage with their ideas. And these would be quite, big set-piece debates, bombastic, combative duels between, intellectuals asking, does God exist? Are science and faith in conflict? All those kinds of big questions. And it was very exciting. And I learned a lot along the way. In fact, I learned really from scratch that actually there is a really good intellectual case for Christian faith, that in some ways the new atheist case against God was more based on rhetoric and emotion than really good intellectual arguments. But that was the way the conversations were being framed at that time. But I have to say that I noticed a real change, a shift in the dynamic of these conversations as the years went on. Because come around 2017, 2018, I was starting to notice a real difference in the way a lot of even non-Christians were talking about faith. Increasingly, the non-Christians I was inviting onto the show, and by now it was a podcast and a video show as well, were actually sort of distancing themselves from the Richard Dawkins style of atheism. They were saying, I'm not really a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, because I'm not actually that anti-religious. I just don't believe in God. And in fact, I was bumping into more and more interesting individuals, and I'm going to be talking about a number of them this morning, who were, again, not Christians, but were taking the value of faith seriously. They were asking questions about whether we could live without something like the Christian story in our culture. If you move on to the next slide, one of those people, again, somewhat of a controversial character in some ways, but over on the right is Jordan Peterson, and I'll come back to him later on in the talk. But this is a shot of a discussion that I filmed in 2018. And Jordan Peterson is a Canadian psychologist. Again, not a Christian per se, but he was in conversation with atheist psychologist Susan Blackmore, and they were debating the question, can we make sense of life without God? And it was really interesting because, again, it was unusual for me to actually feature two people in the studio, neither of whom necessarily subscribed to Christian faith. Normally it was a Christian and a non-Christian. But in this case, you could have been forgiven for thinking that Jordan Peterson, despite being a secular psychologist, was actually a Christian apologist. So heartily did he defend the idea that we can only make sense of human value if we believe in the idea that we're made in the image of God. And he's just one example of the way in which I was seeing a number of people popping up, talking about faith and religion and Christianity in very different terms to the new atheists. In many ways, Susan Blackmore could be seen as the new atheist representative in this conversation, someone who says faith is essentially a mind virus that we would be much better off without. And this was the view that Jordan Peterson was interacting with in this particular show. I'll come back to Peterson and some of his friends in a little while, but I was noticing a change in the conversation. More and more people were coming out of the woodwork saying, you know what, I think we might have thrown the baby out with the bathwater when we abandoned the Christian story in the West. I've tried to tell this story in a book and a podcast series. That's the next slide. And that gives, there's obviously, the book is available today. If you'd like a copy, I'd be glad to sign one for you as well. But I've had the privilege as well of telling this story kind of in real time over the past year, because the book came out just over a year ago. But right up to the minute, really, the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast series, if you're a podcast listener, kind of gives a blow-by-blow account of some of these characters, stories, and what I see as this changing tone in the conversation. And this idea that perhaps, as represented by the sort of the wave on the book cover, the tide of faith may be turning. I don't think we're seeing a tidal wave coming back in our direction, but I do sense that perhaps the secular material worldview, that project, if you like, has reached its furthest limit, if you like. It's running out of steam. And that we may just be starting to see the first signs of people opening up again to the Christian story. So with the rest of my talk this morning, I want to sort of talk about three particular areas where I think we're seeing this. And one way of thinking about this is to ask, what is the best explanation? I'm going to present three reasons why I think people are talking in very different terms today about God, even in secular circles. The reason I've described this slide as what is the best explanation is that one of the things I learned early on in the course of hosting conversations, especially between Christians and atheists, was that actually we all essentially approach life from a worldview of some kind. And in that sense, just as much as I perhaps am standing here as a Christian and need to give an account of my faith to those who are asking questions about it, I'm also going to have questions for my atheist friend. Because I discovered in the course of hosting a lot of these conversations that actually it's not that atheists don't believe in anything necessarily, but actually a lot of the people I had on my show had a very specific set of beliefs about the way the world is, about the way the universe runs. And you could perhaps summarize those beliefs in a term like naturalism or materialism. The idea that ultimately all that exists is matter in motion, the blind forces, if you like, of nature. And that, of course, has all kinds of consequences, that particular belief. There's all kinds of things that stem from that. And I realized in the course of hosting these conversations that it's not that I have to provide all of the evidence and answers, but actually we're both called, the atheist and the Christian, to give an account for why we believe our worldview makes sense. And I think in the sort of the following sort of three areas where I think the conversation has really changed on God in recent years, I'm going to give you three particular reasons why I think the evidence fits best actually with the Christian worldview and not with a sort of secular atheist worldview that the new atheists were really promoting some 10 or 15 years ago. And the way in which I'm seeing a number of other people, not just Christians, talking about this in quite interesting ways. So the first way in which I've seen the conversation on God changing is in the area of what you might call human existence. And this is, for this one, we're going to sort of remain essentially in the area of science. I believe God makes best sense of human existence. It was not long into hosting these conversations on faith that I started to have some of these debates, host some of these debates on science and faith between people from both sides, scientists who were Christians, scientists who were atheists. And of course, science was one of the trump cards, if you like, of the new atheists. It was, new atheism was largely led by people of science who were claiming that essentially science had disproved God. We had no need for that hypothesis any longer now that we had evolution and a sort of an account of how life arose on the world, on the earth, and so on. But the more that I engaged in these conversations, the more I realized there was a sort of an alternative story actually at play. Not only that, in fact, science itself, the scientific revolution, really had Christian origins in the 16th and 17th century, but that also, in fact, what we know of modern science is far more interesting and mysterious than we're sometimes led to believe by some of the atheist, if you like, popularizers of science. That many of the things we're learning about, particularly our place in the universe, the fact we're here as humans, seems to speak about something beyond the universe. One of the particular very interesting aspects of this was a phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. And I'm going to introduce you to one of the people who's really talked about that and spoken about that at length in a moment. But I want to give you a sense of what this is, just for those who perhaps haven't come across it before. Several years ago, I created a short video in which I tried to, at a sort of hopefully layperson's level, give this sense of just how unlikely it is that you and I are here and what it took for us to be here in the universe we inhabit, and why that might point beyond the universe to a mind behind the universe. So I'm going to let the video roll. My wife always reminds me how much younger I look in that video, because it was a few years ago that was created. But it's an interesting phenomenon, one that's been debated a number of times. I've hosted a number of conversations on it. But one among a number of phenomena, actually, that modern science, cosmology is revealing to us, that, as I say, open up rather than close down the God question, in my view. You could add to that the fact there is a universe, the Big Bang cosmology, and what that tells us about the fact that all of time, space, and matter at some point came into being. There's the fact of life itself and the extraordinary chemical complexity that was required for the first self-replicating DNA molecule to come into being. There is the fact we can do science at all, the fact the universe is written in the language of mathematics. Oh, I don't think we need a second round. So I was discovering some really interesting aspects of this whole debate on science and faith. And what I was realizing was that there's actually a very interesting case for saying that actually human existence itself requires an explanation. And the person I mentioned who is also saying very similar things about this is, again, not a Christian necessarily, but someone called Paul Davies. Some of you may be familiar with him, but he's very much a science popularizer. But something of the thorn in the side of his secular new atheist brethren, because for many years, Paul Davies, who works on the Origins Project at Arizona State University, has been writing popular level and academic books about the fact that it is highly surprising that we exist in this universe if we are here by chance. That just doesn't seem to add up. In fact, when I've interviewed Paul Davies, he says he's not a conventionally religious person. He wouldn't say he believes in God. But it does seem that he believes that there's more than just the blind forces of nature at work in the world. And one of the things that Paul Davies said to me, he put it to me like this. He said, the directionality in the universe, going from matter to life to consciousness, he said, I would add comprehension to that. There's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or a purpose in nature. He said, I think that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. And what Paul Davies is describing there, I would reach for a Greek word that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, the word logos. It's this idea of order being spoken into chaos, of life coming out of non-life. It's obviously the word that's used at the beginning of John's Gospel for Jesus, the pre-incarnate Word of God who speaks existence into being. I think what a lot of these, even secular scientists, are coming to realize is that there is a sort of a logos behind life. That actually, when it comes to looking at the way in which we're here, the way in which the universe seems to operate, the way in which science itself seems to operate, that actually there's a good case for saying that the Christian worldview perhaps makes pretty good sense of that, this idea that there is a mind behind it all, rather than the atheist viewpoint, which has to be that ultimately it's the blind forces of nature. It's chance, essentially. We got lucky in the lottery of life. That's just one example of where I think there's an interesting new conversation happening, perhaps in an area that perhaps is a bit opaque to many of us, that we don't necessarily find ourselves in a lot of the time. But if you go into the scientific community in all kinds of areas, there are interesting new perspectives coming up that seem to point beyond simply science and the universe to some bigger questions around why there is such a thing as a purpose, if you like, behind it all. So I believe actually God makes best sense of human existence. But I believe God also makes sense of human value. I imagine that most people in this room, perhaps all of us, believe in the idea of human rights, human value, human dignity. We believe that there are some very real rules that exist, sort of objectively, about how we should and shouldn't treat other people. Again, this has often come up in debates that I've hosted between Christians and atheists. How do we account for this idea that we believe in human value? Is that something that arises from a purely natural, unguided process? Or is there something actually that's sort of built in to the fabric of reality, to the universe? This idea that actually, whether or not we agreed with the idea that, say, slavery is wrong, actually it is wrong. And anyone who believed it was right in the past was actually objectively wrong. They were simply mistaken. If you believe that actually some things are really right and really wrong, no matter what the popular opinion on them is, then you believe in something called objective morality. You believe in the idea probably of the inherent dignity and value of every human being, whatever their gender, race, sexuality, that actually that makes sense. I believe it does make sense on a Christian perspective, because from page 1 of the Bible, we're told humans are made in the image of God. And if that's true, then it makes perfect sense of this instinct we have, that all humans possess this inherent dignity and value. I've struggled to find an adequate explanation for that idea on a purely materialist atheist perspective. And it came apparent in a conversation I had. Again, this was sort of going back to the more new atheist era of the conversations I was hosting. But I did have my first conversation with Richard Dawkins in 2008. And it was a conversation that took place shortly after he'd just had a sort of on-stage debate with a Christian philosopher of science, John Lennox, at Oxford University. And they'd been debating all these issues around science and faith and the Bible and so on. And I managed to sort of get 10 minutes with Richard Dawkins in the sort of after party at a nearby Oxford college. And I managed to sort of go over some of the debate points that he'd had with John Lennox. And in particular, we reached this moment in our conversation where we talked about how we make sense of this idea of human value and human morality on a purely atheist worldview. And I just want to describe exactly how our conversation went. I'm going to repeat it verbatim. I said to Richard Dawkins, but if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favours is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I responded, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say the reason this is good is that it's good? And you don't really have any way to stand on that statement. And he said, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, well, therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and I think if you're a thoroughgoing materialist atheist, as Richard Dawkins is, you should say that. That's the logical outworking, that our morality really is just the happenstance of the hand we happen to have been dealt at this time and place by the forces of socio-cultural evolution, effectively. And it could have been different. In fact, it has been different. There have been cultures in the past where rape was fine. In Roman culture, if you were a senior Roman male, you could have your pick of whoever you wanted. That was just the morality of the time. Why do we instinctively recoil, though, at the idea that actually it's just the happenstance of the hand that we happen to have been dealt by these socio-cultural evolutionary forces? Why do we believe, actually, no, there's something really right and wrong about the way we treat other human beings? And I think that little conversation with Richard Dawkins kind of brought it out quite nicely, actually. That it's very difficult to make sense of this idea of human value, intrinsic human dignity, the value of every single person, whoever they are, whatever their station in life. It's very difficult to make sense of that on a purely naturalistic perspective. If the Christian story is true, if everybody has inherent dignity, worth, and value because of being made in the image of God, that kind of explains it. It's again one of these areas where I've found actually, rather than looking out there at the universe, looking inside at our own sense of who we are, it feels like actually the Christian story again fits better with the evidence that's available to all of us. Again, though, it's not just Christian apologists like me who are making these kinds of points. Again, there's an interesting array of secular thinkers who are starting to talk in very similar terms. You may have heard of the historian Tom Holland. Tom Holland, there's another Tom Holland who is the Spider-Man actor in the Marvel films, and he occasionally gets mistaken for him on Twitter and often leads to hilarious results. But this is the historian Tom Holland. And again, Tom Holland's an interesting person because he will tell you, and he wrote in his best-selling book Dominion in 2019 about his own sort of faith perspective. And he says he was raised in a sort of essentially a Christian home, but any faith he had certainly fizzled out by his teenage years. And he was a happy kind of agnostic, really, into his early adult years. He eventually ended up in a very successful career writing popular historical works, especially on the Greco-Roman world. But the thing that Tom Holland says is that the more he stood in the sandals of the Greeks and the Romans, while he found it a fascinating, quite appealing world in many ways, he also was repulsed by aspects of it. He increasingly found that his own values as a sort of liberal Westerner, his beliefs in human rights, equality, dignity, compassion, freedom, progress, these had really no place in the Greco-Roman world that he was spending time in. Because this was a world that was very different to his own. This was a world where slavery, as I mentioned, was a de facto part of the economy. It was just an absolutely assumed part of life and the way that things ran. The treatment of women and children was very different. Babies, especially girls, they were unwanted, left out on the roadside. Exposure was a common practice in the Greco-Roman world, to be taken by wild animals or people passing through, perhaps sold into slavery. And yet this was the common morality of the time. The fact that some people, as I said earlier, could be the sexual property of other people. A senior Roman male had essentially complete rights over anyone who was his social inferior in that respect. And Tom Holland looked at this world and realized just how different their values were to his own. And he asked himself, well, where did I get my beliefs in freedom and progress, equality, dignity? And he realized he didn't get it from the Greeks or the Romans. And he didn't get it from science or atheism either. They were sort of value-neutral projects, really. He realized that he got them from a very specific source, and I'm sure you're aware of what I'm going to say. It was from Jesus Christ, from the movement that began when his followers began to talk about the idea that the Messiah, the promised Messiah of the Jewish world, had in fact come but been crucified. But he'd been risen again, he'd raised again, and they went out into the world with a very, very unusual, distinctive message about what it means to be human in light of all that had happened. And they went out with their emblem of a crucified God, a victim, essentially, of the powers. And that became the central motif of their message, that actually there is great power in being a victim. In fact, there is a sense in which we have to die in order to conquer. And it led to all kinds of extraordinary social reforms that we live in the wake of today. And in many ways, Tom Holland's thesis in this best-selling book, Dominion, that he subsequently wrote, is that in all kinds of ways, we now are the inheritors of the values that were birthed in the Christian Revolution, but we've forgotten where they came from. We just assume in our secular post-Christian society, this is just the way common sense, rational people think. But actually, it's not, because we are a very unusual moment in world history. As a Western culture that holds these ideas of freedom, equality, dignity, human rights, those have not existed in many parts of the world throughout history and still don't in many parts of the world today. And Tom Holland's point was, as he put it to me in an interview, Justin, I struggle to believe in the claims of Christianity, but in almost every other way, I realize I am a Christian. And he's been a really interesting sort of stone in the shoe of, again, many of his secular peers, reminding them that the values they hold dear come from the Christian story. They don't come from some sort of secular humanist project. His view is that actually what now kind of is often referred to as humanism in a secular sense is simply a sort of version of Christianity that's been stripped of the God stuff, basically. But it really still relies on the theological assumptions about the idea that we're made in God's image. So Tom Holland has, been an interesting person to track with this, and he's got his own sort of interesting story that goes alongside this intellectual journey that he's been on. He now, of course, is incredibly influential as well. You may well be a listener of the Rest is History podcast. Tom Holland reaches millions of people every week. And I think he's extraordinarily well placed as a sort of person from outside the church, but who is advocating for the importance of the Christian faith in our culture. And there's a whole extra story that perhaps I'll go into this afternoon about his own journey on that front. But there are other interesting voices in this area as well. I could mention Louise Perry, who is another interesting thinker. She's gone on an arguably similar-ish journey to Tom Holland. She was raised in a essentially kind of liberal feminist sort of background in terms of her education, very much a sort of non-Christian, agnostic in terms of her upbringing. But it was in the course of working after university in a rape crisis shelter that she started to really ask interesting questions about the sexual revolution of the 1960s and what it meant for our culture today. Because she was raised in, a fairly typical view of, well, as long as everyone consents, and isn't doing any harm, people are free to do what they want in terms of sex and relationships. But she saw that that kind of approach actually wasn't good news for everyone, especially many women and children, that she was seeing as somehow the victims, actually, of the sexual revolution that actually was rather good for males, but not so good for women and children. And she went on to write a thesis, a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Again, not from a Christian perspective, from a purely secular perspective, looking at the sort of, again, cultural and evolutionary sort of pressures that come to bear, and the way in which the sexual revolution of the 60s has actually been quite damaging in all kinds of ways. We've ended up in a very sexualized, sort of pornified hookup culture, which she sees actually as having really retrograde effects on people. And interestingly, in the course of researching the book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, she did find that there was one funny old institution that had historically been somewhat successful, despite all its failings, at producing stable, flourishing societies by putting guardrails on, especially on male sexuality, and allowing the flourishing of family units and countries and whole societies. And it was this funny old institution called monogamous Christian marriage. And in the course of writing this book, without having any really reference to Christianity, she found herself by the end of the book realizing, there was a story we once told ourselves about relationships that actually did work for quite a lot of people. Again, Louise Perry has been on an interesting journey herself, looking at what that might mean, not just at a sort of social level, but at a personal, religious level. But what this comes back to for me is that thinkers like Louise Perry and Tom Holland and others, they're starting to realize that morality doesn't just appear out of a void or out of just some rational principles that we all happen to agree on. It comes from a very specific source, and the source actually in the West has been the Christian story. It's just we've often forgotten that. And I think that ties in rather neatly with the idea that actually to have a basis for morality itself, you need an ultimate source of morality. And for me, God is the best explanation of that. And I'm so interested to see the way in which this conversation on human value is touching in all these different areas and coming back to the question of whether perhaps that story that we put aside and put behind us at one time, the Christian story, maybe we need to look at it again. And you get these influential people like Tom Holland, Louise Perry and others as well, talking in very different terms about the Christian story to their secular peers and audience. The third way in which I think the God conversation is changing, we've talked about human existence, human value. I think God also makes sense of the search for human purpose. One of the main reasons I believe that the new atheism itself has waned in our culture is that I believe it kind of has run out of steam, because it was trying to tell a story about reality. The scientists and philosophers and thinkers who were sort of at the center of the new atheism itself essentially were telling a story which was about, well, it was actually a non-story. It was a story that said, actually, ultimately, all human purpose, endeavor, value, even our sense of right and wrong, beauty and everything is ultimately an illusion that's been foisted upon us by a kind of completely deterministic set of natural laws and processes that are just kind of reaching their eventual fulfillment. Again, Richard Dawkins has a well-worn phrase that he used in some of his lectures and his books, where he talked about the fact that the universe simply doesn't owe us any meaning or purpose, and that when we look at the universe, it looks precisely as if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no truth, no good, no evil, no beauty, just blind, pitiless indifference. The problem is when I look at the world and the universe, I see a very different set of things to the ones Richard Dawkins sees, where he sees only these natural processes. I see a very different set of things. I do see beauty and love and truth and justice, and most people actually do as well. And the problem was that this atheist story of reality that underlay the kind of the skepticism and some of the fun kind of elements of it in the media, it ultimately wasn't a very satisfying story for most people. There was a whole other kind of interesting story that's laid out in the book and in the podcast series about why new atheism itself kind of internally unraveled for all kinds of interesting reasons. But in the end, I would say ultimately people's existential questions weren't answered by the new atheists, and they started to look elsewhere eventually. In many ways, I think the new atheist project, while it made a lot of noise and was quite successful in the mid-2000s, by the mid-2010s, it was starting to run out of steam. The reason for this, I believe, is because we're kind of primed to live in some kind of a story of reality. And for generations upon generations in the West, the story, whether people sort of consciously realized it or not, the story of reality we kind of lived in and measured our life by was the Christian story. A story about a God who had created us, we're made in his image, that gives us this kind of sense of purpose and worth. And even though life is really difficult and hard, it's a story in which that God stepped into his creation, lived it alongside us, died, rose again, and invited us into a kind of a culmination of that story, a future hope and purpose that we're all kind of invited to join with God in. That's the story, whether, again, people consciously recognized it or not, that largely shaped people's lives, actually, in a large degree. And it was a kind of a jointly shared story. But I think as we've seen the sea of faith go out in the West, that story then sidelined and forgotten in many parts of our culture today. The problem is that people still need a story to live by. G.K. Chesterton said, when people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And I think that's what's happened. And the story of atheism, the story of naturalist materialism, simply is not a good enough story for most people to live their lives by. So people start to grasp other stories. And I think those stories come in all shapes and forms. I think there are stories sort of on the progressive left, if you will, around perhaps sexuality and gender and certain ideologies, which become effectively someone's sacred story. Something that becomes, if you like, fills that God-shaped hole and functions in the place of the Christian story as their sacred story. You could equally look at people on the right, political mythologies. We're all aware of how the election went overnight. And there are some people who see Donald Trump as essentially the savior, the great savior of the world. But that's another story. It's a story people are using to make sense of life and investing themselves at a quasi-religious level in terms of their faith and their sort of investment in that story. There's lots of other stories. The point is, we need a story to make sense of life. The psychologists tell us if we're just bouncing around chaotically, if we don't see ourselves or our life as having any sort of narrative, then that's very bad for us. And so we will gravitate towards these quasi-religious stories that help us to make sense of life. The problem is, of course, in our culture, all of these stories are bashing up against each other and creating these culture wars that we're all so familiar with now. And it's leading to this tribalism and this division and this kind of breaking up of the unity that once at least at some level existed in society, because we don't have a story that unites us anymore. And I think that's why the search for human purpose is so significant in this moment we're living in. Because the humanist, rationalist, atheist story of reality is running out of steam, and the stories we're telling ourselves in our culture are not working either. And I think that may be setting the scene, giving us the conditions, as messy as it looks, giving us the conditions for people to be ready to hear the story that has kind of been sidelined and forgotten, but is still actually, in all kinds of interesting ways, bubbling away under the surface still. Again, he's a controversial character, but one of the people I think who's kind of, at a public level, been doing this is Jordan Peterson. Again, if this name is not familiar with you, I'll just give a very potted history, but Jordan Peterson is this Canadian psychology professor who kind of rose to fame, especially in 2018, on the back of kind of taking certain sort of stances against political correctness in Canada. But what was fascinating to me when people started sending me his lectures and things, was he was a sort of secular psychologist drawing thousands of people, especially young men, interestingly, to his lectures on purpose and meaning and identity. And where was he pointing them? He was pointing them towards the Bible as the source of this meaning and purpose and identity, even while he himself, it was difficult to pin down where he stood in terms of religious belief. When I asked him, do you believe in God, when he came on my show, he said, well, it depends what you mean by God. Is very difficult to sort of pin down, because he takes everything at a very Jungian psychological level. He's very invested in the value of Scripture and the value of the Christian tradition and the story, but he tends to take it in this very sort of specifically psychological way, in which it's highly symbolic. And he's had many debates with atheists and other Christians on where he lands on these things. But regardless of where he lands himself, what's interesting to me is the outsized effect that he was having on other people. And I was bumping into more and more secular atheists, agnostics, who were saying, you know what, I've been rethinking Christianity recently. These were people who had been turning up for the New Atheist, for their lectures and videos and podcasts, but were now listening to people more like Jordan Peterson and saying, I've started to reevaluate the whole thing. Wherever Peterson lands himself, whether you agree with him or not, he certainly opened the door intellectually for a number of people to take Christianity seriously. And I've seen a number of people walk through that door and call themselves Christians today because of his influence. I think what Peterson specifically has done, and again, others sort of a similar nature who are these online influencers, is they've tapped into something that I would describe as the meaning crisis in our culture. There's a meaning crisis because we no longer have any stories that work for us. And we're living in this kind of toxic culture war where people are increasingly miserable, actually, despite our advanced technology and relative wealth and prosperity in the West. We have this soaring mental health crisis, especially among young people. And I think it's to do with this fact we don't have a story to make sense of our life anymore. And Peterson, interestingly, by pointing them back to the Christian story, is actually opening up the possibility that this funny old book, the Bible, and this funny old tradition called Christianity might still have some relevance to our life today. In fact, it might be the answer to lots of the questions we have today. One really interesting way in which this came to light just about a year ago was in the story of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali is really interesting because arguably she was the most famous female atheist in the world. She was very much one of the New Atheist speaker set. She didn't make it onto the 4 horsemen list, but she was arguably the 5th horsewoman of the New Atheism. Her backstory was that she was born in Somalia, but fled from a sort of fundamentalist Islamic regime there to Europe. And once she was in Europe, she very much rejected religion in all its forms and became a sort of spokesperson for atheism. As I say, wrote her own sort of best-selling anti-religion book, Infidel, was very much part of the speaking circuit with the New Atheists at atheist conferences around the world. And I'd sort of been very aware of her at the time that she was, in circulation in those years, but then sort of hadn't really heard much from her in the last few years. And so I was incredibly surprised when she suddenly appeared, literally about a year ago, November last year, reappeared and writing a viral article online called Why I Am Now a Christian. And it turned out that Ayaan Hirsi Ali had been going through a sort of her own personal crisis of sorts, where she'd found that the atheist story itself wasn't working out in all kinds of ways. She'd also come to see that the meaning crisis that existed in our culture wasn't being answered by the secular humanist atheist story. And she'd essentially become converted at a sort of intellectual level by the Tom Holland thesis, that actually it's the Christian story that gave us our values, our modern values of tolerance and, gave us the seeds for democracy, gave us our belief in human rights, equality, dignity, value. And she wrote this article explaining how she'd had a kind of cultural, almost political conversion to Christianity. But she also talked about her own journey, and in subsequent interviews talked about the fact that she'd kind of experienced this sense of nihilism. Increasingly, she couldn't make sense of life from a purely atheistic perspective, and she had been sort of self-medicating really with alcohol. She'd been through a whole series of counselors and psychologists, none of whom really seemed to help, until finally one of the people she was being counseled by said, have you thought about praying? And she said, well, I can't pray because I don't believe in God. The God I was raised with was a monster. And this counselor said to her, well, if you could believe in God, what kind of God do you think you could believe in? And Ayaan Hirsi Ali started to describe the kind of God she thought she might, the kind of God who wouldn't be a monster at least. And she started to describe this God. And she said, as she was describing this God, she just realized she was essentially describing Jesus Christ. And she thought to herself, well, maybe I don't need to invent a new God. Maybe I should look at this person who claimed to be God. And so she gave it a go. She started praying. She started going to church with her husband, the historian Neil Ferguson. And she says it completely transformed her life. She was baptized in September this year. In fact, I believe the whole of their family were baptized. And This is quite remarkable, because this was arguably the last person you might expect to embrace Christianity. Now, there's all kinds of interesting debates to be had, and we might talk about this in the afternoon, about the kind of the conservative aspect of a lot of these people who have been talking about in some of these cases. Ian Hirsi is politically very conservative, as is Jordan Peterson, as is Douglas Murray. So there's a lot that we need to tease out here, but it's interesting that there's something is happening. And when I see someone like Ian Hirsi converting to Christianity, very surprising story, I know that something's changed in the atmosphere, because her story was almost an encapsulation of what I was trying to describe in my book, which had only been published a few months before this sort of shock announcement of hers. And I think at the root of it, it is this search for human purpose. Because I don't believe that the atheist materialist story of reality, in which we're essentially just the product of the blind forces of nature, and you just sort of get whatever you're given in the lottery of life, I don't believe that's a story people can live their lives by. But the stories they are living their lives by aren't working either. And that's why I believe that people like Ian Hirsi represent a new openness. As those stories are running out of steam, there's a new openness to investigating the original story that did once give people their sense of meaning and purpose and identity. And as I see these shifts happening in all kinds of areas, whether it be science and the question of human existence, value, the sense of where did we get our morals from, the historical story, or this psychological thing of how do we make sense of the idea of human purpose and meaning, I see lots of secular people starting to ask very different questions and provide very different answers to the new atheists of only 10 or 15 years ago. And for me, I guess I'm an optimist at heart. Whereas a lot of people have been tempted to simply decry and bemoan the fact that the tide of faith has obviously gone out on the West in so many ways. I wonder whether God may be in the business of surprising us again. Often, actually, interestingly, with prophets from outside the church. And I'm not saying I agree with everything everyone says in these sort of secular conversations, but I think there are important lessons for the church to learn. And the fact that there is actually a bubbling up, I think, in our culture of people looking for a story that makes sense of their life again, who have run out of steam, as I say, on the stories they've currently been telling themselves. Interestingly, when I published the book, a lot of my atheist friends, when I sort of started posting it online, said, "What surprising rebirth, Justin? This is a fantasy. Can't you see the statistics?" I did, of course. I was fully aware of the statistics. I talk about them openly in the book. Christianity has been on the decline in the West for a long time. And a lot of what I was talking about in the book at the time were essentially anecdotal. But interesting, just over this past year, and especially having done a bit of a deeper dive through the podcast series, I'm noticing more and more not just anecdotal evidence that this is happening, but actually some really interesting data as well. Perhaps I'll reference later on this afternoon. But I do genuinely believe something is happening, and it was interesting to hear Nigel talk about the fact that he just senses something's changed in terms of the conversations he's having. I'm getting that from a lot of other church leaders as well. A lot of people saying, "Justin, I've been tracking the book and the podcast, and I've sensed something similar, actually." It's not sort of the same story everywhere, but it does feel like the tone, the atmosphere has changed in some way, even if it's not sort of, doesn't mean our churches are full to the brim, obviously, but there's a new openness. And I think we need to be ready for that. And we also need to kind of be ready in faith for that. Because, yes, there's a lot to bemoan in the church. There's a lot of we need to do to get our house in order. There's all kinds of things that we could, critique and we need to sort out. I worry all the time about some of the manifestations of Christian faith in the USA and that have brought Donald Trump back into office overnight. But I also have this hope that somewhere in the midst of it all, God is doing something surprising and interesting that can often defy our assumptions and expectations. And I think is starting to really surprise people outside the church as well. So I want to encourage you with that. And perhaps, it's best expressed again in a phrase that was given, I think, by G.K. Chesterton, who said, Christendom, the Christian church, has experienced a series of deaths, but it has always risen again because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave. And I think that's true for us. If you're feeling a bit despondent, disillusioned, beat up about the state of the church, whether it be locally, nationally, or globally, just remember that we've been here before. Our forefathers and mothers have been here before, and God often surprises us, whether it be a Hebridean revival, whether it be something else. I wonder what it'll be for us. I wonder if we're just starting to see the first turning of that tide of the sea of faith, and what God might want us to do if we're here to welcome a tide of meaning seekers again. Bless you. Thank you, guys. There we are.
That's right. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, well, we've got about half an hour before we break for lunch. Yeah.
Graham, I had a discussion last Friday with someone about values and morality, and he said, "Oh, we just live with contradiction," and I didn't have a nice, simple answer to that, but that was where he was saying, "Oh, we just live with those contradictions. I don't believe in the Christian faith. I have some morality. So I'm just prepared to live with contradictions." So what would you have said to that person?
Yes, certainly. Just the gentleman was just saying that he had a conversation with a friend who is not a believer. When it came to morality, they said, "Well, I'm just happy to live with a contradiction, that I do believe in morality, but I don't." I guess he was saying, "I don't claim to have a foundation for that morality in something like God." Well, if that works for your friend, I guess that works. I would just say most people struggle to live in the tension of living in a contradiction like that. And I think that tension is kind of becoming more apparent. I think it's interesting that people like Tom Holland, the historian I mentioned, are increasingly pointing out the contradiction. I think a lot of people haven't even recognized there is a contradiction. They've just assumed that the sort of humanist moral principles that are generally shared in Western culture just sort of somehow exist. I think what's interesting is people like Tom Holland very specifically telling people now, actually, these do have an origin, and they didn't come out of the ether. They came from a very specific story, the Christian story. And I think the reason people are kind of tuning into that more is because we now exist in a world where there are actually other worldviews on offer. We have some fundamentalist forms of religion on our doorstep with a different perspective on human rights. We have Russia, we have China, we have, and these are players where we've realized actually the kind of the Western democratic values that perhaps we sort of just assumed any, flourishing society will eventually adopt. We've realized actually they're not the only game in town. And I think that fear actually is what has actually sharpened the sense for a lot of people, especially in these intellectual conversations about, well, where does the moral values that we espouse come from? And it's why someone like Ayaan Yali became convinced that actually secular humanism it's not a strong enough story to support them any longer. We're going to have to go back to something like the Christian story. Now, how that happens is another question, but I just sense that there's increasingly few people. I think more people are realizing the contradiction. That's probably where your friend is, and that they've kind of lost this kind of fuzzy kind of, this is just the way the world is view. But I think I'm meeting a lot of people who have moved beyond your friend to say, I'm not sure we can hang on to this morality in the absence of something like the Christian story. But thank you.
Justin, as you look over the conversations over the anecdotes, what would you say about how this is playing out, or you're seeing this playing out?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because just listening to some of the analysis on Radio 4 on the way up from Woking about the election overnight, I think people are working out that a lot of the votes for Trump and a more kind of conservative view, if you will, of life, are coming from, interestingly, young men. And that's a lot of the demographic that's turning up, interestingly, for people like Jordan Peterson and others. And I think, and the research and the polls show us that there's been a real divergence between men and women, especially young men and women, in terms of them leaning more progressive or liberal or conservative. And that's worth bearing in mind when it comes to this whole question of this meaning crisis that we're experiencing and the way it's affecting different demographics. And I think an older generation, where there's more of a sort of a sense of the Christian story, there's still that sort of resonant, that it's sort of still in the background at some level for people. There's a kind of a sense in which they're not so interested in embracing the Christian story because they kind of still have a sense of it floats around them in a way that they're somewhat familiar with, but it doesn't lead to them needing to kind of embrace it. Interestingly, the younger generation are the ones who really haven't been exposed to the Christian story at all in any really meaningful way. Completely unchurched, by and large. And interestingly, they're the ones who are most in the center of this, I think, this meaning crisis, which is kind of becoming a mental health crisis. And one of the aspects of this is that the way it's hitting young men, especially, and this is going to be the subject of so it's kind of been on my mind, but one of my episodes in the next season, is a kind of male identity crisis in the West. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, but it's leading a lot of them to look for structure and purpose and identity in lots of different places. Some of them in kind of very conservative forms of politics, even in, it accounts for a certain number of young men being really interested in more radical forms of Islam. It's leading to some young men going off after certain influences like Andrew Tate with his very uber macho version. And it's leading some people to the Jordan Petersons, who are kind of the much more toned down version of that, if you like. And it's leading some people into church, but quite traditional forms of church, interestingly. There's been a huge boom in the US in Eastern Orthodox parishes, and they've been seeing lots of young men starting to attend. There's been quite a boom in some Anglo-Catholic circles, where there's more of a kind of a sense of rigidity or structure, if you like. And interestingly, again, very recent research in America, I think it's limited to America, but showing the number of Gen Z men for the first time overtaking Gen Z women in church. And that's almost unheard of in most church circles in the West. There's always been an approximately, well, for a long time at least, 2/3 female, 1/3 male kind of dynamic in most church streams. So to see this happen, so something really interesting is happening. And there's a lot going on there that I think you would have to unpick. But for me, it's coming back to the fact that this meaning crisis is hitting different segments of culture, different generations, male and female as well, in different ways. And it's been very obvious to me, as I've kind of, again, unpacked a lot of what I wrote in the book and across this past year, that it's the key demographic where there's this openness to Christianity is among young men. And that is quite significant, I think, for how the church deals with that. Because obviously, I want this to be something that everyone experiences. But the reality is, it's sort of showing up most strongly in certain specific demographics. And we need to be very wise about how we handle that, not just baptizing everything that's going on in the culture with our blessing, but saying, okay, how do we respond carefully and wisely to what's going on in the culture there?
Justin, I'm kind of intrigued to know why you use the word surprising. Like if you're looking at your podcast, I mean, in a sense, everything is surprising. I guess, well, Paul's precedents for that sort of conversion. I guess people of the Lewis are probably surprised that they found themselves compelled to go to church reasons they didn't know, but Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. So, should we be surprised? I'd just be interested to know why he chose that.
Yeah. Well, at one level, yes, we should all have faith, shouldn't we, that God is not finished with the church, and we shouldn't be surprised. But I think we still are, because I think when you live, I have only ever lived in a world in the West in which the church is in constant decline. If I had perhaps been in the generation of those 90-year-olds you mentioned, I might have a different sort of sense. I wouldn't be so surprised, because actually I'd seen something happening. That's why I think even at a Christian level, the word surprise is perhaps relevant, and displays more about our potential lack of faith that God is often doing things behind the scenes. But I think really I wrote the title more for the outside world, because I think there has been a general assumption, largely in secular culture, that God is more or less dead and buried, and religion is just a pastime for people who decide not to do football or golf on a Sunday morning. And so the surprising element of it is about the way that the conversation is reignited in these secular circles. I think that's the surprising thing. Part of the surprise for me is the way many of the new atheists themselves have changed their tune quite radically. Even Richard Dawkins, earlier this year, calling himself a cultural Christian and saying reasonably positive things about the influence of Christianity, which would have been I think he would have been surprised to hear himself talking in that way only 10 or 15 years ago. So there are surprising things, at that level. And I suppose I just wanted to kind of pull that out in the title to say, hey, there's something worth taking note of here in that way.
If I could just jump in there. We do need to re-evangelize the church in terms of the openness and the readiness. What I'm finding is are genuinely surprised. Congregations, and our last leaders' day was focused on how we confidence in the gospel. We all say, but what I'm finding week by week is that that's an astute. And I think there is an injection of generation that the previous generation has been telling us switched on.
Yeah. Yes, and I think this is really important, coming back to Neil's question about how this is playing out in different generations. There is Gen Z, arguably the most unchurched, generation, the one that's most likely to tick no religious beliefs on the surveys, is also, interestingly, the surveys tell us, the most open to spirituality. So they're an open book, interestingly. And what's interesting about Gen Z, especially, is they don't come with a lot of the baggage that millennials, Gen X, boomers come with, because they haven't been exposed to Christian church. Now, they might, get a bit of a shock once they start coming to church, who knows? But the point is that actually they're surprisingly open. And I've been hearing all kinds of interesting stories from people such as there's the Fusion movement, who work across campuses across the UK, talking about a really, for them, again, surprising openness that they're encountering just in the last few years among students, non-Christian students, that they just have never seen in all their years of working on campuses. And again, I just feel like God's doing something interesting there. And we're seeing, I think, interesting manifestations of that popping up in things like, if any of you are familiar with the Asbury Awakening, as it was called in the USA, which was very much a Gen Z-led kind of spiritual hunger and thirst bubbling up in this kind of 2-week revival in Kentucky, which was very different to the kinds of more sort of slick marketed revivals that you often hear about in the USA. It was quite it felt very genuine, and it told me there's something going on. There's this meaning crisis is actually driving, I think, a lot of young people to God, interestingly. So So yeah, I just think there's more going on in that sense than sometimes meets the eye.
Thank you, Justin. I have one of the questions about generation question as well. We're going to Gen Z in the room, or not? So it's really interesting actually to hear because some of that experience and that openness to spirituality, definitely. I'm quite surprised to hear you describe it as an openness to Christianity because certainly in my experience, I've seen a lot of openness to witchcraft, tarot, mindfulness, and manifestation, that kind of thing. So I wonder if that's something that you've kind of seen in your experience as well. I wonder if that's a difference in gender.
Yeah.
Being more towards Christianity.
I think so. I think you're absolutely right, and I don't want to in any way suggest that the openness is purely Christian. As I said, and even among young men, there are other options, if you like, that are kind of enticing them in different directions as they kind of go on this search for meaning. And I'd absolutely agree that there is that the openness involves things like, on TikTok, there's this phenomenon, witch talk, which is a lot of young women, especially, kind of engaging in charms and hexes and trying to kind of manifest and kind of take control of life through kind of somehow ordering the universe to their advantage and so on. So all of that is going on, absolutely. I suppose for me, the optimistic take I have on that is that all of that is evidence of a search that's going on. And I think God can use that in some way. And for me, it's, I think there's more kind of possibility of what could happen with that person on TikTok than the kind of complete materialist atheist who has just sort of discounted spirituality and God altogether. So I think that there's a sort of an opportunity, if you like, for the true story that I think is bubbling away underneath that search that people are going on to come out. Again, I can't predict exactly what direction all of those things will go in, but I think that there's a sense in which I think a lot of those manifestations of the search for spirituality, I think people are actually, interestingly, being confronted sometimes with the fact it doesn't ultimately work, I suppose, and that a lot of these kind of other ways in which people are trying to do that kind of search aren't working. I read an interesting book just over the last week or so. I'm going to misquote it, but it's a new book by Rod Dreher, in which he talks about all of that sort of thing, the way in which there's been a huge surge actually recently in interest in things like the occult and, psychedelic drugs and witchcraft online and all of that sort of thing. And the way in which it's actually, I think, it's all a sign of people's search for the transcendent. And in fact, it's kind of bringing a lot of people actually, I think, face to face with the negative aspects of spirituality as well, and there's all kinds of interesting stories of people then being driven on a search to, if you like, the truth behind it. So, as I say, I will see what comes out in the wash, and that returning sea of faith could come back with all kinds of weird and wonderful different manifestations. But I still think there's a really interesting way in which the church can be ready to receive even that kind of interest and reorient it towards kind of the true story. Someone on the sound desk, I think.
Going back to what you said about young men, are you familiar with Mark Driscoll and what he was doing 20 years ago?
Yes, I had an interview with Mark Driscoll in 2014, which was quite memorable on that front. But not everyone in the room will necessarily know who he is. But Mark Driscoll was, at the time, some 15 years ago, leading probably America's fastest growing church at the time, Mars Hill Church in Seattle. But he was a very controversial character, still is, because he's now back in ministry again in Arizona, I think. but the church grew very fast, and he had a very sort of quite authoritarian, quite macho, kind of alpha male kind of way of preaching, and it was very attractive to a lot of young guys. So the church grew very quickly, especially in terms of young men. But it all kind of imploded around, if my memory serves me right, around 2015, 2016, when, in fact, I spoke to him in 2012, and then it all imploded around 2014, I think, when all kinds of allegations of abuse and toxic leadership and things emerged and led to this very apparently successful church network suddenly kind of just collapsing in a matter of months. And there's, if you want the full story, there's another podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which you can hear the whole story. But yes, what was your question? Having given that brief.
Having said all of that, I think what I've been saying, if you get young men, you will also get young women. And he actually made a conscious effort for saying young men.
Yeah.
And that yes, leadership. We started didn't pick up on that one thing.
Yeah, and I would say, the broken clock is right two times a day and everything. That I'm not saying that everything Mark Driscoll ever said or preached was wrong, just because of what transpired in his own ministry. I think it's an interesting idea that if you attract men, women will follow. I don't think that's always going to be true in every circumstance, and I think it's interesting that there is this divide that I mentioned earlier happening ideologically and kind of between men and women, and so I probably don't know enough about the realities of the kind of cultural forces at work as to whether that claim is precisely true. What I will say is, I think the church needs to take more seriously the differences that ultimately do exist on average between men and women. And I think this is where you could take a lesson, careful lesson from Mark Driscoll, is that he knew how to tap into more of a male psyche, in a sense, but not always. I think sometimes it was quite detrimental, actually, in the way he did that. And it may have, as I say, it brought a lot of young men in, but then the church collapsed. So it's not exactly like this was a perfect sort of evangelism strategy or anything. But I do think there's something about recognizing that there are kind of, broad brush differences on average between the way men and women tend to engage church, faith, and so on. And to make sure that in our churches, we're not weighting it in either direction so that we only attract men like this or women like that or whatever, but actually that we're feeding everyone with the way that they need to be presented with the gospel to show them why it matters to them and to their lives. So I'd be as equally unhappy with a church that was full of lots of young men, but only a few women, as I am with churches that are full of lots of women, but only a few men. It's the church that Christ founded was one in which men and women, people of all different social statuses and ethnicities, were this glorious, harmonious mixture, and it was a beacon to the rest of the world about what the world can be like. So I don't want to just import kind of any cultural stereotypes, in a sense, into the church and say this is what we need to do to make sure that we have men in our church. I think we need to be aware of those dynamics, but we also need to understand that Christ does something quite unique as well when he invites people to be part of the family. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Yes, I will touch on that a bit more. I think there's some important lessons to draw out for the church, and I'll do another shorter talk at the beginning of the next session in the afternoon on the way in which I think we need to I think basically shift approach in some ways from what I've spent most of my life doing, which is this more apologetics, rational-based approach to faith, to where I think actually people are now, which is much more about engaging their imagination and, as you say, telling a better story, as you said, a meta-narrative about what life is about and the way that Christianity can speak into that. So, yeah, we'll definitely come to that a bit more later. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Seems maybe a bit of a tangent, but I was reflecting while I was listening to you, you talk about other influences going on, you talk about obviously China, etc. I was just thinking, you speak a lot about in the last few years, and obviously quite a lot of stuff is happening in the last few years, and I wonder how much you see like world events impacting this stuff. And, you know, obviously thinking about the pandemic. You know, for me, I suppose I can't watch what happened in Spain and not think climate catastrophe. What the hell are we doing wrong? I wondered if I don't know how that affects different generations. But I thought it was across the spectrum. But I just thought, how much is this stuff that happens influencing this? I'd love to believe you're right. I'm braver, said tide to change. Is the stuff happening in the world, that part of it as well?
Oh, for sure. And I've kind of given my sort of spin that, you know, with these three areas where I think this conversation is changing. But there's all kinds of other forces, I think, happening. COVID is an interesting part of the mix there. The kind of, especially for a younger generation, the sense of impending doom that the climate change thing brings is kind of having a really important, I think, psychological effect. I think that the game-changing thing in the last 20 years has been the internet, social media, the digital revolution. That is completely transformed the way we communicate with each other, and especially younger people who are now, you know, the digital natives. And there's a lot of, we're starting to realize just how fundamental some of those changes are and how much they're within a generation completely reshaping the psychology and ways in which young people think of themselves and interact. So it's almost, it feels like culture, maybe every generation has felt this, but like culture has just sped up in the last 20 years. The rate of change is so extraordinarily quick now. And I think it does feel like a lot can change actually in a short space of time now. And that's why a lot of the forces I'm talking about, you know, have been there for a long time, you know, since the Enlightenment really. There's been this kind of change in the story about reality, moving away from a religious way of looking at life to this kind of secular way of looking at life. But it almost feels like it's reached this really pinch point in the last 20 years or so, especially I think with digital technology kind of accelerating a lot of the phenomena that are associated with this meaning crisis, that I think has been gathering pace throughout the 20th century, but now it's kind of suddenly reached this really kind of specific moment now. So I think there is something to be said for a lot of these external forces that are kind of culminating. But again, and it's the Christian in me speaking, I have this inherent hope and faith that God, despite it getting incredibly messy, and it might get a lot worse, who knows, that God's going to be doing something in the midst of all that. Because a lot of that, things often have to get worse before they get better. It's often a crisis that brings people to the point of faith. I mean, interestingly, if you go back to World War II, the historians will note that there was an interesting bump in the generally downward decline of church going, baptism and everything. There was this bump after the two world wars, and it's not hard to see that was because of suddenly people being faced with their own mortality and the world being upended. We've then gone through a period of relative peace and prosperity in the West. But as if society starts to fragment, if wars and rumours of wars suddenly become very apparent on our doorstep, the climate emergency, whatever, is kind of changing the way people think and act, and a sense of crisis and so on. I don't know, I can't see what that looks like, but I just wonder whether, again, it might all be part of something that is kind of, not everyone, but a certain number of people are going to be looking for something stable within all that. And the Christian story, when people discover it, suddenly can be quite transformational in that way, in terms of giving them a kind of a foundation for their life that they're otherwise lacking.
Yeah, I've come across quite a lot of situations where people become faced in surprising ways, as you put it. One of them is a young man just rocked up at the church for the first time ever and said that he's come to church because he's got so wrapped up in conspiracy theories as an atheist, and just come to the conclusion that God was real.
Mm.
And I think some of these surprising ways that people are bringing quite a challenge to the traditional way of looking at church. So I suppose my question is, what cultural or missional changes does the church need to make to be more open to the surprising ways people come to faith?
Well, that's basically what we're going to be covering in session 2. So at the risk of giving you too much of a teaser, why don't we start with that in the next session, because it's a really great question, and I'm really interested to hear more about the person you mentioned. But yeah, is that okay? Because otherwise I feel like I'll be keeping my powder dry more for the afternoon session. Thank you very much, though. It's a great question. Okay.
Thank you, Justin. I just noticed that Hank was left the room. Right, so we're at lunch then. Let me just give thanks, shall I? Thank you very much for this morning. It's very thought-provoking, and over to this afternoon. So allow me to give thanks, and then we'll go for lunch. My understanding is that lunch is going to be in the room where you pick up your coffee and setting out tables there. I believe it's sandwiches. I'm not going to be involved in sorting out the lunch. And I think by the end of my prayer, I would Nigel entered the room. Father, thank you for all the ways that you've been speaking to our lives. Thank you for the lunch that we shared together. Thank you for all the ways that you bless us. Help us to appreciate your goodness to us. Help us to pray. Take time to notice those who don't have what we have. Bless us, Lord. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone. And it's been lovely to have lots of conversations the books and over lunch with lots of you, and just get just some really interesting stories of what's happening on the ground in different ways for folks. So I will be around a bit longer. I think we're aiming to sort of finish at 3, but I'll certainly be around to about 3:30 if anyone wants to grab a book and so on and have a conversation. Very happy to do that. So thank you. So as I mentioned, Nigel and I thought it might be useful in the second half of this to ask, well, what does this mean for the church? And as far as I understand, most of you are part of a local church in some form of leadership. And that's kind of been the question that's sort of been on my mind as I wrote the book and as I've posted the podcast series. It's fun and interesting to describe all the different facets of what I see as this so-called surprising rebirth of belief in God. But what can we practically take away from this? And so I hope what I present today is helpful at some level. But I'm very much learning as I go with this, and so I really genuinely want to give plenty of time for Q&A so that we can all learn hopefully from each other, share our own experiences. You do not have to agree with everything I say from the front, but I'll just present a few ideas to perhaps spark our thinking together, and hopefully we can have more of an extended time for chatting together, Q&A wise, think about what we could take away from all of this going forward. In the final episode of the first season of the podcast, episode 30, I sort of, as I say, tried to give a few takeaway lessons for the church and what it might mean if we're going to engage this kind of meaning seekers. And broadly, what I wanted to present is a sort of a version of that. And where I start that episode is actually looking back to the late 60s, early 70s, and the so-called Jesus People revolution that took place primarily on the west coast of California. If you can bring the slides up and maybe cycle forward 2 or 3 slides. These are things we've seen already here. That'll be. So that's Pirates Cove Beach in California, and there was a really interesting thing that happened in the late 60s, early 70s, where suddenly a lot of hippies from the counterculture started to go on a sort of quest for God, for transcendence, for meaning. And it resulted in a quite extraordinary few years in which up to 500 people a day were being baptized along the shorelines of Orange County and elsewhere in California. And it was an interesting moment that sort of actually went against the cultural expectations at the time. Next slide, I think, is, this was the Time magazine cover, I think in 1972, that sort of profiled this extraordinary phenomenon happening. The Jesus Revolution is what they called it. And what was interesting is only a few years previously, there'd been another famous Time magazine cover, the famous sort of Is God Dead cover with the red writing and the black background. And that was kind of symptomatic of the sort of mid-60s when a lot of people were talking about the death of God and, we've entered this new secular age. And yet just a few years later, this extraordinary sort of phenomenon happens, the Jesus People revolution. And one of the churches at the centre of this was Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. I visited. There's recently been as well, I think the next slide shows it, if you had a chance to see it, a film that came out last year, Jesus Revolution, that sort of told the story of the kind of unlikely friendship between Chuck Smith, the pastor of this small Baptist church, Calvary Chapel, and his unlikely friendship with a sort of hippie-turned pastor, Ronnie Frisbee, played by Jonathan Ruby, and then the young chap in the middle is Greg Laurie, who kind of became part of this movement as well. And what was interesting watching that film and sort of doing some of my own research in previous years on the Jesus People movement was that there were some interesting markers of this sort of revival that took place. One of the markers was that there was a real strangeness to it. It was very the beliefs and the kind of counterculture that the church suddenly found there was an openness to. Was very marked at that time with the hippies and so on that were coming through. There was a real challenge around how to engage and accept or bring in these sort of dirty, smelly hippies, to these kind of quite straight-laced churches that they were kind of suddenly turning up to. And that's sort of part of the story really there. And in a sense, a lot of those churches ended up, a lot of new churches began on the back of this movement, which were essentially, eventually being run by the converts from this Jesus People movement. And the other interesting aspect of it is that there was a real sense that people were looking for something, a bigger story to live their lives by. And those sort of 3 elements are something that I'm going to tease out today in terms of this could look like for us, if there is some rumour of a revival at some point. And again, I want to be really clear, I'm not talking about a revival in this Surprising Rebirth of Believing God book or series, but it could be the foothills of something, who knows. I wrote an article for the Spectator magazine at Easter, which was essentially laying out my thesis, but they gave it the title, not me. A Christian revival is on the way in Britain, which is definitely an overstatement. That's not what I'm saying. But as I said, I do think there's things you can learn from previous revivals of various kinds. And I want to draw out some lessons in a sense from Jesus' revolution and from Scripture as well, particularly Acts 17, Paul's famous speech to the Athenians, about what some of this could mean for us as a church in the modern 21st century West. My parents, in a sense, were converts of the kind of the British counterpart of the Jesus revolution. They kind of came out of quite a hippie background and converted in their early 20s at university and joined a quite radical Christian community that I had my early years in. And so in some ways, I am a sort of a product of an interesting move of God that happened some 50 years ago. But the question is it just a kind of strange anomaly? Was it just one sort of interesting blip? Because the statistics says there were probably over 250,000 people who found faith through this Jesus revolution movement on the West Coast. But actually, I think we still feel a lot of the ripples from that, interestingly, even today. A lot of the modern church, especially modern worship music, essentially began in that sort of the heyday of that sort of revival and that sort of energy. So what could today's cultural landscape and the things that we're seeing, and some of the things I was referencing in my first talk, what could that mean for the church today? If you'll allow me, I want to just remind us a little bit of Paul's address to the Athenians at Mars Hill. If we go to the next slide, I'm trying to remember what I've got on this slide. Keep going, yeah. So, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story, but Paul is in Athens. He's sort of an unexpected sort of stop off on his missionary journeys, and he's very disturbed by this city full of idols. As a good God-fearing devout Jew, it's offensive to him. But he goes and he does his usual thing of presenting the message of Jesus to anyone who will hear it. And eventually he gets the ear of the thinkers and the philosophers in Athens, and he is invited. Though in fact I had an interesting conversation just yesterday with N.T. Wright, who I was interviewing, who says actually what happened at the Areopagus wasn't exactly an invitation to a nice seminar with cheese and wine. It was actually more, he was taken to court, is what we should understand this as being, because the Areopagus, Mars Hill, was where they essentially had their court, and that was where people got tried and their ideas, if you like, to see whether they should be, sentenced in some way. Apparently, that was Socrates who got bumped off at the Areopagus because of his views. But they invited him to tell them, explain himself when it came to these foreign divinities that he seemed to be talking about. And famously, Paul delivers this sermon, this speech, in which he very much engages with the Athenians on their home turf. This is just one part of the speech he gives. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you.'" And I think there's something in here, isn't there, about the way that Paul finds these cultural touchstones with people, even though he's very offended by this idolatrous culture that he's walking through. He doesn't choose to engage by kind of shaking his fist and condemning everyone, but says, look, I'm recognizing something here. We've got something in common. You're extremely religious. And he tries to find a point of connection with the Athenians, as very different as they are in their conception of God or gods to his own. He finds something that he can share in common. And I think that's a challenge to us, is so often the church is seen as being somehow an affront to the culture. It is somehow it stands in opposition, and that's the way churches have often felt about themselves. But there's something about the way Paul manages to engage the thinkers of Greece that just actually opens up the conversation rather than closes it down in that way. And the thing is that I guess a lot of us think, well, we don't live in that kind of a culture today, full of idols and so on. But actually I think we still live in a highly religious culture, even in our post-Christian culture. There's lots of aspects of our culture that still remain, even, as people have lost that belief in God and the Christian story, actually highly kind of quasi-religious almost. Next slide, I think. What have I got here? Yes. This was an interesting sort of lawn sign when I was in the US recently that I saw out on someone's lawn. And in this house we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything. And what struck me about this is that this lawn sign exists on the lawn of someone who probably doesn't think of themselves as religious, might even think that Christianity and church is part of the problem. And yet what you've got here essentially is a sort of secular creed. We're all familiar with what a creed is, sort of a set of statements or beliefs, doctrines. I believe in one Lord, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, I believe in His Son, Jesus Christ, and so on. That's a Christian creed. Well, this is a sort of secular creed. And what it tells me is that people are still fundamentally religious, actually. It's just they often don't think of themselves as religious. But actually, we all serve some kind of a God in our lives. And as I was saying earlier on in my first talk, there's this kind of storytelling part of ourselves that is that kind of religious impulse, I think. We need a story to make sense of our life. And we're often picking and choosing in our culture from different stories or certain things. But ultimately, people are still looking for a story to make sense of their life. And I think that's what Paul is sort of tapping into. As different as the Athenians are from him, as a sort of, a scripture-soaked Jew, he still recognises there's a common sort of groping, if you like. Next slide, if you would. Yes, I mentioned this phrase from G.K. Chesterton earlier. I think it speaks into that idea that actually people are all still looking for a story to make sense of their life. When people choose not to believe in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They become capable of believing in anything. Next slide, if you would. Again, reinforced by this famous phrase from Blaise Pascal, the 17th century sort of mathematician, philosopher, talking about the God-shaped hole, or in his words, the God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each person. I think that still exists. I think what Blaise Pascal saw then is still evident today, even if people don't think of themselves as religious. And what more slide on? And I love the way that Paul does pick this up in his speech on the Areopagus, because he says, from one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. He allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for him and perhaps break for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. That sense that actually people are looking for God, and he's not as far from them as they often think, or we often think. I've noticed in this surprising rebirth sort of thing that I've been documenting, that actually even people who at one point in their life looked like they really weren't interested in God, it turns out they were kind of looking for God all along, and God was not as far from them as they thought he was, or even as I thought he was. And I just wonder if that's true. And what's so interesting in a sense about, again, the way Paul does this is he uses the Athenians' own poets and thinkers, he quotes them back at themselves, to kind of illustrate the fact that the evidence is already there, that you're looking, that you're searching for God. And I want to draw that out as we go through a few of these themes that I think have sort of emerged, that kind of tie into some of what Paul's saying, tie into some of that Jesus people revolution, and maybe tie in to what we're experiencing with the surprising rebirth of belief in God. The first thing is, if we go to the next slide, the first sort of lesson that I've drawn from a number of these conversations with thinkers, with some of these public intellectuals, people on the ground who are seeing something shift in their community, in their churches and so on, is that I think there's been a sort of a change in the way the church should engage with people when it comes to the Christian story. So I titled this, Make Them Wish That It Were True. I really began my journey really with sort of evangelism, with apologetics, Christian apologetics, the sort of rational defense of the Christian faith. So over 20 years ago, well, nearly, or 19 probably years ago now, I began this radio show, Unbelievable, on Premier Christian Radio, that brought Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. As I said, it was at a time when this new atheism was riding high, and that seemed like, you know, the thing to do was to debate these big ideas, ask, can Christianity stand on its own 2 feet intellectually? These were the questions that were sort of circulating. Give me some evidence for God. Show me why I should believe in the Bible, and so on. And that was good, and that was relevant for that moment. But actually, I think, by and large, those kinds of questions, while they're still relevant for a number of people, that's not where the energy is any longer in terms of the public conversation on faith. I think most people who are waking up now in the midst of this meaning crisis I described aren't saying, give me some evidence for the existence of God, a philosophical argument, if you will. They're actually waking up and saying, give me a reason to get out of bed. They're asking existential questions about what's the point of life. I think we see that especially acutely in this mental health crisis that a lot of young people especially are being confronted with. And that's actually where a lot of these psychologists and influencers and people I've already mentioned are actually tapping into. They're tapping into those kinds of questions. A kind of sense of they're not starting with a kind of, here are, 5 evidences for the resurrection or 3 philosophical arguments for God. They're just starting with, what is life for? What's the point? And I think that's where we need to begin as well. Now, we may eventually end up with those important intellectual questions somewhere along the way, but I don't think that's where most people begin. And perhaps one way of looking at this is actually looking at a very successful Christian apologist of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, who was an amazing intellectual mind and wrote some classic books on apologetics, the problem of pain, mere Christianity, that sort of set out the intellectual case for Christianity. But of course, what C.S. Lewis is really most memorable is the Chronicles of Narnia, which were obviously fantasy fiction. But actually, I think far more people have been converted through Narnia than through his apologetics works. Because what Lewis did with Narnia was he gave people permission to imagine what it would be like if Christianity were true. But he set it in this sort of fictional realm, this fantasy realm. And of course, Aslan stood in for Jesus, this sort of brave, wise, but not tame lion. And it was a world full of truth and beauty and right and wrong and the battle of good versus evil. And interestingly, I think what Lewis did is he sort of gave people imaginative permission to kind of immerse themselves in that world and made them wish that it were true. I mean, I don't know about you, but, there's probably even a few adults who have knocked on the back of a wardrobe just to check if there might be a world of talking beasts and fawns behind it. But I think the interesting thing is that obviously he right there in the stories at one point said, look, Lucy, you can't come back to Narnia. You have to go back to your world. And there you're going to have to learn to know me by another name. And I think that was a really helpful way in which Lewis said, I've given you a story that's sparks your imagination. What if it were true? What if it really were true? And I think that's where we have to begin. And then maybe, Lewis's important work on the intellectual case of Christianity might be important to some people as they do that, but I don't think most people are going to be interested in the intellectual case of Christianity until you've made them wish that it were true in the first place. And again, Blaise Pascal, I can't remember if this is on the screen or not, probably not. No, I don't think it is. He had this interesting phrase. He said, make religion attractive, make good people wish it were true, and then show that it is. So how do we do that? I think we start where people are. I think we start with art and music and literature and film and their own story, their own passions, the things that wake them up in the morning, that they get out of bed for. And we kind of start there and ask, well, what if there is someone who fulfills all of those longings and dreams and passions? I think this is the challenge to the church, and I'm probably only telling you something you've heard in many different ways, is that we're meant to use everything, not just reason and intellect, but all of the gifts we've been given to tell the story of Christianity. And we need to do it as creatively as we possibly can, with all our God-given creativity and hopefully Holy Spirit-infused passion, to go out and just tell the story in new ways to people, and to meet them where they are. And I think people like Lewis and Tolkien and others who kind of did that in their generation so successfully, they did it in a way that really helped so many people to see the underlying beauty and truth that is there all along, and then help to transpose that in a way that other people could then come behind and say, and find a way in for many of those people to start to take them seriously. I'm surprised today actually how continually relevant C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are. There's still a huge following, both Christian and secular, for their work. And there's something about that, the resonance that they have, that I think we need to capture. It's something to do with us bringing back a sense of the imaginative in our Christian witness, and not just playing by the rules, if you like, of, interestingly, the rationalists and the atheists, and saying the only way to persuade people is through an intellectual set of arguments. There is a place for that, but it's not actually where most people will begin. If you want a kind of much more interesting overview of all of that, there's a wonderful thing called Ian McGilchrist, who I would recommend you go and maybe have a look at if you want to kind of. He's got a wonderful thesis on the brain, essentially, and the right and left hemispheres of the brain, which have frequently been associated with, on the left, the kind of scientific, analytical side, and the right brain, the more artistic, imaginative side. And that's a bit of a sort of oversimplification, but he's got a really interesting, very influential thesis on the way in which our culture has essentially become a left hemisphere-dominated culture, in a way that actually inverts the relationship that should exist. And I think there's a lot we could learn, again, from him, a secular sort of psychologist and psychiatrist, about actually how we engage people's imagination at a much more interesting level. So I think that's my first takeaway from having looked into this and spoken to a lot of people who've been on this journey, that we need to engage the imagination, we need to make people wish that the story were true again. But that's going to look different probably for all of you in terms of where you begin with people. The second lesson is keep Christianity weird. This has been a phrase that's popped up a number of times in my conversations with a number of these sort of seekers and so on. So I spoke recently to an agnostic journalist called Ben Sixsmith, and he finds himself attracted to Christian faith, but he struggles to believe. But he wrote an article a couple of years ago. He said this, and I saw a lot of Christians sort of sharing this on their social media. He said, I am not religious, so it's not my place to dictate to Christians what they should and should not believe. Still, if someone has a faith worth following, I feel that their beliefs should make me feel uncomfortable for not doing so. If they share 90% of my lifestyle and values, then there's nothing especially inspiring about them. instead of making me want to become more like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me. And I've heard similar things from other people, sort of on the outside of church, who are very interested, looking outside, looking in. Tom Holland, who I mentioned earlier, I think we've got the slide of it again. You heard me tell his story, but when I had a conversation with him earlier this year in London, a public conversation, he again spoke quite candidly about this idea that he thinks if Christians want to attract people to church, they actually need to embrace the weirdness of Christianity rather than be slightly embarrassed about it and try to kind of sort of disguise it. In one conversation, he put it this way, he said, the churches need to absolutely embrace their beliefs rather than being embarrassed about them. The churches have to lay claim to everything that is weirdest, most countercultural, most peculiar. Don't duck all the stuff about angels. Major on that, he said. Which is, you know, and he's an interesting person because when he does go to church, Tom Holland actually goes to London's oldest church, St Bartholomew the Great, over 900 years old. Steeped in a very Anglo-Catholic tradition. And when he goes, he's told me it's because he's not looking for what he can already get in the culture around. He's looking for something mysterious, something otherworldly, something that transports him into a different story. And he says, you know, that for people like him, just kind of offering a kind of warmed over version of secular humanism with a bit of God on top is not attractive. He can already get that. He can get good advice. You can even get, you know, probably much better versions of the Coldplay music that, you know, exists in many churches. He's not looking for that either. But he says what does attract him is something quite mysterious and different and otherworldly. Well, that's not going to be true for everyone. And I'm not saying the answer is for all our churches to become Anglo-Catholic, you know, smells and bells or something. Because actually, in this conversation, he said the other area that he notices is actually attracting quite a number of converts is the more charismatic Pentecostal end of the church. Interestingly, these two ends, if you like, the very sort of mysterious Anglo-Catholic, sort of ritualized end of the church and the quite sort of fervent Pentecostal end of the church are both the ones where there appears to be life, and it's the sort of the middle, if you like, that is arguably the place where people are struggling to attract people. And Tom Holland says he thinks that's because when Christians embrace the kind of weirdness or the supernatural, it's actually quite attractive to many people who are looking for a different story from the one they can already get in the culture. And I think the challenge for many churches is well, what does that look like in terms of the way we present ourselves to the culture? That might be at a kind of the level of what we offer in terms of worship on a Sunday morning or whatever, but it might also be about, you know, there might be an ethical challenge there as well. If you kind of blend into the culture so seamlessly that the problem is you might end up looking invisible. You're not seen anymore if you kind of just are presenting the very same things that people can already get. And so this is the challenge, I think, for churches. So what does it mean to keep Christianity weird? But I think there is something about doing that. There's something important to take away. That it's actually embracing, kind of being comfortable in our own skin, that is actually the secret sauce for why Christianity is attractive. It was why Christianity grew so fast in the first century. It was very weird. And the point Tom Holland makes is that a lot of the things that made Christianity so successful and made it grow so rapidly, things to do with its embrace of the equality of everyone, the way it treated women and children compared to the culture around it, because those have just become absolutely part and parcel of Western culture now and its assumptions, unfortunately that stuff is no longer, you know, a kind of selling point of Christianity, because everyone's kind of bought into that. They've just forgotten it was created by Christianity. So he says, well, what do you major on now? And his view is we should major on the supernatural. I mentioned his story, you know, there's a personal element to his story. It does involve this kind of personal journey as he started to work on this book, Dominion. He started going to some churches and found himself very attracted actually by the intellectual side of Christian faith as he read, you know, lots of the early church fathers and thinkers, but also to, yeah, the sort of the mystery, kind of re-engaging with something that he thought he'd sort of ticked off his list. And specifically in the conversation we had in London, he was very candid about sort of a personal experience of what he believes was essentially a miracle in his own life, that he kind of prayed for in a very kind of agnostic, desperate way one Christmas Eve a couple of years ago, but which a number of things happened afterwards, which he struggled to deny seems to be perfectly made to answer the prayer that he prayed. And he was a bit sheepish and a bit kind of like, this is like not the normal territory for a historian to go into. He struggles a bit with that. But it's interesting that it's those kinds of experiences alongside this intellectual journey he's been on that have kind of brought him to the edge of belief now. And I just wonder whether sometimes the church needs to be a bit more brave and at the risk of being embarrassed even, by kind of being a bit more out there, actually, that this is different. We have these real beliefs that God's actually at work in the world. And I'm bumping into more and more people who are now kind of talking about that more openly. One of the changes, I think, in the atmosphere that I've been talking about is that I think a lot of people have been having these experiences all along, actually. It's just they never talked about them because there was a sort of generally sceptical atmosphere that prevailed, which just, oh, that's ridiculous, you know. I just think that there's more openness now for people to recognise weird things, and there's a place for kind of where the church can speak into that and say, actually, I think you might be onto something. So that's all to say, I think the church needs to keep Christianity weird and not be afraid to do that. It can be counterintuitive because a lot of what we've often learned over the last several decades is, you know, the church needs to be super accessible, super seeker friendly, kind of bring down as many barriers as possible for people. And at one level, all that's true. I'm not talking about erecting unnecessary barriers. But at the same time, I think something that actually attracts people to Christian faith is a level of seriousness and a kind of level of challenge and demand. And actually, sometimes, you know, again, in the early church, people weren't told everything up front. There was a sort of sense in which people had to take steps into the church before they were told the next thing. There was a sense in which you went further into the mystery, and it's okay for people not to understand everything. Sometimes that's part of the attraction, ironically, I think, is that actually people are being invited into something which they will grow into and discover, and isn't sort of all served up on a plate. The third lesson is about creating a church community that counters cancel culture, if you'll forgive the tongue-twisting title. I think if there is going to be this coming back of meaning seekers looking for a purpose and identity, the church is uniquely situated to be able to receive them. The question is, will we be ready to receive them? That part of that is going to be about getting our own house in order, as I said. There's lots of aspects of church life that so often will inevitably be off-putting to people if they come into an already dysfunctional and toxic situation. But at the same time, the church, in all its messiness, I still truly believe is the hope for the world, and is a place that actually is becoming more and more unique in the world today. Because we live in a world that is actually still, as I said, quite religious, but in often all the wrong ways. It can be a very judgmental place, where if you don't have the right beliefs or say the right things in the right settings, you will be cancelled, whether you're on the left or the right on many of these issues, where there is no place for forgiveness. The church at least recognises that we're all fallen, that we're all sinners in need of a saviour. And in some ways, it's one of the few places today where you will still encounter forgiveness and grace. And my sense is that people are looking for that. They're looking for a place where they can bring their whole selves, their wounded selves. And they're not finding many places in the culture where they can do that. So I think there is actually a unique opportunity for the church to speak into and to welcome people who are experiencing that the kind of the sharp end of the religious, but in all the wrong ways, part of the culture. And to discover actually that real religion is very different to that. And I also think it's becoming one of the few places where you can do that in person. Part of the internet and the digital revolution and everything else is that we're living increasingly in relationships that are all mediated through devices and online. And I don't know about you, but I was really glad when we were able to lift the restrictions after COVID and start gathering in person again. Because I really felt, I'm sure many of you did, just how thin relationships and community became when it all had to be mediated through Zoom and everything else. But the reality is, most people are getting fewer and fewer opportunities to actually engage in face-to-face community today. I had my first experience over the summer in San Francisco riding in a driverless taxi. And I was spoken at church, and just for the novelty really, they ordered me a driverless taxi, which is kind of a new thing in San Francisco, which prides itself on being sort of at the cutting edge of technology. But literally, you order it on the app, it pulls up to the roadside, there's no one in the car, it's completely automated, AI, whatever, robotic car. You get in, it knows where you want to go, you press go, and it drives you off to your destination. And it does it all without there being anyone with you in the car. And it was fun and different, but also really scary, because I thought this is the future, where you don't have to interact with anyone. Everything can be done. You don't have to have any real relationship anymore. AI can become the new girlfriend that will, fulfill your every wish and never, tell you to clean your room up or whatever. This is the world we're creating for ourselves. But it's a very scary world. And I think the church is fast becoming one of the few places where you still put front and centre the idea of getting together in person. In all our messiness, but actually that's the place where you actually grow as a human being. And I think we need to lean into that. A community that counters cancel culture is about the community, the human community that it is, and the way in which we... And I know that's really difficult in practice, because we all know how difficult it can be to be that community, but it's worth it. It really is worth it. And I'm increasingly seeing some of the people that I'm meeting who are just turning up in church for the first time, kind of suddenly finding something that they didn't almost realise existed on their doorstep, as a place where they can find this kind of people who are going on a journey and so on, and who, even if they don't agree with everything, even if they're kind of, it turns out, most churches have people within them who disagree with each other about a lot of things, but somehow they still gather around something or someone that is bigger than all of those differences. So it's not like just going to the country club or the political party or whatever, where you all have basically the same thing in common. It's some cause or activism or whatever. It's actually about a person that you gather around that somehow, in its most beautiful form, the church somehow transcends all of those divides and brings people together in a unique way. So I think we need to somehow lean into that as a place where we can say people can come home and find that, perhaps for the first time. Those are my 3 takeaways for you this afternoon. And I want to just maybe end with a story, because, as I said, the book and the podcast series are much about the individual stories, about these big trends in our culture. The story of Paul Kingsnorth, who you may have come across, but he's an award-winning novelist and poet, and his own story for me kind of brings in a lot of these things, actually, because Paul Kingsnorth sort of was raised in a sort of nominal Christian atmosphere. He went to a church school and that kind of thing. None of it stuck, though, and by his teenage years, he sort of rejected or he'd become a kind of teenage atheist. But he had a real love for nature. He loved being out in the woods and the mountains with his dad. And he eventually went into a sort of a very passionate pursuit of ecology and environmental activism because of his love for nature. And he found that actually he wasn't very good at being an atheist. And he found he wanted something. He felt like, when he was out in the wonder of the all of nature, he couldn't deny there was something. And so he actually, for many years, became a Buddhist and sort of pursued a kind of a sense of trying to find meaning by looking within, if you like, and the sort of the mindfulness and the thankfulness in that tradition and so on. He said, there were lots of positives to that. But he still couldn't shake this sense that when he was out in the wild, in the woods, he wanted to worship. There was this kind of natural sense in which he wanted to not sort of just look within, but sort of to worship. And so he actually, for a few years, became a Wiccan. He kind of basically went out and did the nature worship thing and said, hey, this might be a way to express it. And he was there, sort of doing the chanting and the sort of the stuff in the woods with the coven and everything. But he said he kind of quickly realised actually that this was actually a bit of a pastiche of New Age esoteric beliefs, married with what he realised in the end was sort of Christian heresies. And it didn't quite work. And the last thing he was expecting was that Christianity would be the thing. Because he thought he'd tried that and he knew what it was. But Paul Kingsnorth started to have a whole interesting range of experiences. He suddenly started getting contacted by people in the writing group that he led, who turned out to be vicars of things, asking for advice on sermons. And lots of people who he hadn't thought were Christians turned out to be Christians. One day his wife, who was not a Christian, just said to him over dinner, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "Don't be daft, what are you talking about?" He started having dreams about Jesus. And these were dreams that he just couldn't shake the memory of when he woke up. And he started to take it a bit seriously. He started to dip his feet in. And the way he described it to me was that he sort of got dragged, sort of forcibly almost out of Wicca, into the Christian story. And it's interesting, it wasn't really an intellectual journey for Paul Kingsnorth. It was a journey of starting to reinvestigate Christianity, but seeing the story, when he found it afresh, kind of made perfect sense of his journey, of his longings, of his desires, and the things he wanted, this need to worship. Interestingly, where he's found his spiritual home is in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's interesting to me that a number of the thinkers I've met have been gravitating towards those traditions, which are far more about an experience, that kind of about the numinous mystery of engaging with God, rather than a more Protestant, if you like, way of looking at things, which is much more about sort of ideas and concepts and sort of nailing down a doctrinal way of approaching faith. That's a very broad brush way of, but essentially, there's something about stepping into a story and with your whole self that is attractive to Paul Kingsnorth. And he now, I think, is an extraordinary evangelist, actually, in his own sphere for Christian faith. If you ever get a chance to read some of his work, or indeed the essay he wrote about his own conversion, The Cross and the Sheep, it's really worth reading. And I think if it can happen to Paul Kingsnorth, if it can happen to Ironhersey Ali, it could happen to anyone right now. It feels like Paul Kingsnorth's story is an example of this way in which the weirdness of Christianity is actually becoming quite attractive again. And the story that Christianity tells, people are starting to wake up to the fact that there might be a good, true and beautiful story that is better than the story they're currently living. And I think there is an attraction to the community again. In all its messiness, I think the church can still be that place where people find grace, forgiveness, and what it means to be human again in a world that is increasingly becoming inhuman in all the ways I described. So I just want to encourage you again, if you're here and sort of feeling a bit deflated or, whatever about church, actually, I think there is an enormous opportunity These are quite general principles, and they're going to look different in all of our different local experience. But I hope that some of those, engaging the imagination, making people wish it were true, keeping Christianity real, and creating a community that counters cancel culture, is helpful in some way for you as you go back into your churches to go and tell that story again. Thank you again.